Welcome to B Cube Sunday morning. And it is indeed a Sunday morning. I can look out there. The days are getting long enough that I'm doing this while it's light out and I can see the sun is shining. So we're going to limit this to 3 minutes today so I can go play with the dogs. Okay, we won't. But it is beautiful. Um, so we are joined today with Kate Ristau of the
Willamette.
Willamette. Willamette. I've been calling it Willamette ever since I've heard about it. And nobody has ever corrected me before. And so now I'm stuck with that in my head. But Kate is, we have with us KG Anderson and Brenda Clough, who are going to chat with Kate about all of the wonderful things that the Willamette writers do. I looked them up and I didn't realize you had as many chapters as you do. Um, you're kind of like a George R. R. Martin book. Uh, so,
just sprawling.
Yes. No blood, no blood.
oh, I don't know. I've heard that some meetings get interesting. But I will leave you to that. And Karen, take it away.
Well, okay. Welcome, Kate. I've heard a lot about you. This is the first time I've ever met you in digital person. I was wondering if you could start by just telling us a little bit about the scope of the organization. I'm interested in a lot of how it's grown and changed, but tell us what it is now so the audience has a feeling.
Yeah, definitely. I'll talk about what it is now, and we can talk about what it was in the past too, because we've been around since 1965
Wow.
and started out in Portland, and then now there's chapters all over the Pacific Northwest, from like down in Grants Pass. We meet in the Grants Pass Library, and our regular monthly meetings, our workshops, are now free and open to the public. So that means any writer can just come into a meeting. And that means that there's workshops, but there's also like networking, and there's coffee and critiques and all these different ways that basically we can help support writers. So we're here as both a resource and a community for writers.
And how large is it? How many writers do you feel are in some way active in it right now?
Yeah, and it changes. It changes, I would say, like year to year, in terms of like who's involved and why they're involved and what they're interested in. In terms of just our email list, we have about 6,000 writers that are like interacting and participating in some way. And then we actually have a membership also. And I mentioned that our membership people used to be members of Willamette Writers, and then they would go to the workshops. And if you were a guest, you had to pay to come into the workshops. And now the members just support the organization. So there's about 1,300 members that are there as members and are excited to be members, but then are also helping support and bring in those great critiques and workshops and conversations. So.
How many chapters are there now?
I'm so bad at math every time, the numbers, y'all. So I'll talk through some of them actually. So I personally, I live in Tigard, which used to be where you could either go to Salem or you could go to Portland as like your chapter. So I used to go to Salem all the time, and then the Wilsonville traffic got bad. So I personally, as myself before I became the executive director, would go to the Salem chapter, and then eventually the Portland chapter. And so there's Salem, Portland, Hillsborough. Over in Newport, there's a wonderful chapter that meets at the Newport Public Library. We also have young Willamette Writers chapters. So we have young writers that are high school and middle school writers, and they actually just met yesterday at the Beaverton City Library. And they had a great workshop with Waka Brown, who's a middle grade author. She talked about folklore and bringing in parts of her own culture and her own background into these stories. But she's been writing spooky stories recently. So there was a lot of talk of horror and ghosts yesterday.
By talking about horror, you've actually brought me into the issue of genre. do you have genre specific and functions, or do people pretty much mix it up?
Yeah, people definitely mix it up. We have some genre specific stuff that I'll talk about, but for the most part, like I'll go to a workshop and a meeting that you can kind of choose which workshops you want to go to. So we did have one like specifically on haiku, but you had poets there, but then you also had screenwriters there. So you had people that were trying out haiku and trying out different forms. But then you can also go to a dialogue workshop that has romance writers next to sci-fi fantasy writers, next to literary fiction writers. And some of my best friends, like through Willamette Writers and other writing organizations, which y'all know I'll talk about too, they've come through those groups and those workshops that are multi-genre. But specifically, we do some things like brown bag lunches that are aimed at specific genres. So we'll have a sci-fi fantasy brown bag lunch. But what does happen is we'll have a sci-fi fantasy brown bag lunch that has a bunch of sci-fi fantasy writers and also a romance writer and also a poet and also, people who just come regularly to different Willamette Writers meetings because they love the community and meeting other writers.
I'm glad you said that about community, because I'm always shocked when I go to a non-literary social event and somebody says to me, I'm a science fiction writer and I have independently published 2 books. And I'll say, oh, are you involved with, and I'll rattle off this long list of writing communities, and they'll go, oh no, I had no idea.
It is awful. It is awful how young writers, they don't realize how deep the roots are in the genre. And I spend all of my time, it's good for them to know about these things, not only for the organizations, but for themselves. Someday you really might want to know about SIFWA's contract committee.
Mm-hmm. And that's, on that SIFWA note, so we from Willamette Writers, we work with a lot of different organizations, but I also personally volunteer with a lot of different organizations. And so when the pandemic happened, like Willamette Writers, and continues to happen, when we switched our meetings to being all online for a while, and then eventually we became like hybrid workshops and hybrid meetings. But it wasn't a huge transition for us because since we have volunteers, we have 75 volunteers right now that are all across Pacific Northwest and even some in Illinois and Chicago and New York. So we'd been using Zoom before the pandemic started. So we pivoted and went online and kind of even grew our workshops and our programming even more. But in the wake of that, I also talked with some people from SIFWA, and I was like, if you need any help on the Zoom side, like I know how to do the Zoom, Zoom.
So many Zoom virgins over there.
In all fairness to people, SIFWA is the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. Not everyone. I'm discovering there are all these associations, including the Horror Writers Association, which has some different standards and practices.
Oh yeah. And all of these organizations are more focused. SIFWA is very focused. Horror is even more focused. But what I like about the Willamette Writers is it's, let's roll in there. Children's writers, people who write poetry. I'm sure you do nonfiction as well. You're sitting there and going to write a biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Go,
Yeah, and there's, it's that interesting thing of working with the horror writers. A bunch of people who do things with Willamette Writers are also part of the Horror Writers Association, and the same thing with me, where I'm part of like the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. And all of us, we realize that we're all doing a lot of the same things across different organizations, just maybe serving different audiences or like trying to get writers connected in different ways. And so a lot of us actually work together behind the scenes now. We have an organizational meeting for the Oregon Writers Associations, like Word Crafters and Oregon Writers Guild, where we all get together and have conversations, the Oregon Poetry Association, and just talk about writing and talking about how we can help writers and connecting people across different groups.
And that's a really powerful synergy, because there's some things that, maybe you don't want to get involved with, or like a big thing. I'm thinking of like the Disney rights grab a few years ago. You get everybody in on it. You know, you guys, SIFWA, the Screen Actors Guild, and then you start to get some real muscle. And that's how you force, you know, evil to back down, and, you know, the mouse had to give way. That's the kind of thing that you need to do. You need that broad sometime. And I think SIFWA is particularly good with the crime fighting and scams bit. And so rather than you guys redoing all of that stuff, you just send them over to Writer Beware, where somebody's keeping track of all the creeps in the industry. And, you know, this is all to the good. It's in unity, there's strength.
And a couple of things on that. We, you know, you mentioned Writer Beware. We, for the longest time, have had the purple and pink Writer Beware marketing cards that we would give to writers. And as we're talking about, you know, if you're thinking about an agent, if you're thinking about a publishing house, like, you know, you should do your research. So even if you meet them at a conference, or if you meet them like, and you get along really well, like part of that, you know, responsibility as a writer is going behind the scenes and looking and seeing like how it would actually be to work with an agent or work with a different press or publishing house.
There's a lot of like people who begin and don't know this stuff. And so you have to learn it, but it's to your good. You know, the last thing you want is to be taken for a ride by a criminal. And then this would be really sad. You know, this does nobody any good, you know. So I think we're doing a good thing just by telling people about each other.
Yeah. And I love you mentioned
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add the contracts committee. Well, yes. I was just the SIFWA contracts committee, where when you have a contract, you know, and you're trying to decide if you should get published, and you look at something and it's just overwhelming because there's so much information about the industry that you might not know as an early writer or a later writer. And yeah, so some of those resources can really help. Karen?
Okay, I wanted to know if you were going to be at Emerald City Comic-Con.
I'm not this year. I go every couple of years. Like, are you going to be there this year?
Well, I was curious because I go there to help out at Ed Vic's comic books booth. And of course, I go to the writing part, and I'm amazed again at how many writers and writing groups I know that are really not networked in. Science fiction people who've never heard of SIFWA, and they're putting out, you know, and also how many people are doing a lot of different stuff. Writers who are now into graphic novels. We have a question from someone who wants to know how these science fiction and fantasy art scenes connects with the writers.
Oh, that another whole separate world.
I have written some middle grade stuff, and everyone said there's no market for it unless it's a graphic novel. So it was,
and the wonderful thing, I'll do two parts of that question. So like in the middle grade zone, there's a huge market. It just it actually pushes more into like library and school markets. So there's just kind of like a different way that you need to like think about middle grade and market middle grade and talk about middle grade, which you totally know. But in terms of that, seeing that sci-fi fantasy art scene like connecting in. I love that you brought up like Emerald City, Rose City Comic-Con. Like a lot of times you can meet a lot of those artists and make those connections from art to writing at like cons specifically. So NorwestCon is one of my personal favorites because it has like a good writing workshop track. And then you can also have fans coming in, and you can have art dealers coming in. And so there's so much kind of interaction across all those different communities.
We had a question.
We're hoping, aren't we, that the World Science Fiction Convention will be in Seattle in a few years.
Yeah.
It is.
And boy, that will be really good, because I think that last year the World Science Fiction Convention was in China. This year it's in Scotland. That's a long way from here, both ways. But if it's in Seattle, holy cow, we can have a good time.
Well, we have someone here who is interested in knowing how they, as a science fiction and fantasy artist, could interact more with people in that field. And definitely going to NorwestCon is probably the way to start, because there's a strong representation of writers who work with artists and also definitely of other artists.
Yeah, and the art show where you can go around and meet other artists and see what people are working on. And then at the same time, there's the dealer room where you can go and see the books, and you can see a lot of that art featured on book covers across sci-fi fantasy.
And there's a whole separate organization, the science fiction, artists. And of course, now I can't remember their precise name, but Google would kick it up. They exist. They hand out an award. I think it's the Chesley. And so they do they do all kinds of stuff. They usually piggyback their meetings onto Worldcon just to make life easier for everybody. So there'll be a little the way SIFWA has a meeting at Worldcon, the artists also have a meeting at bigger conventions. So you could find them, and they probably have a list of everything.
I think the other question I saw, go ahead.
Go ahead.
It's the Association of Science Fiction and Fantasy Artists. And that's a big international thing, but they almost always have things into who's local. And a lot of this art, interestingly, I went with Margaret Organ Keene to an event for tabletop gaming and cards, magic cards, and that's where there are tons of science fiction and fantasy artists, and really and workshops and things. So if you look for the Magic the Gathering conventions,
which I don't know if y'all know this, but Magic the Gathering is played a lot in my house, and on my tabletop right here on my desk, I have a Magic the Gathering with a Nissa playmat, because my husband used to play a lot and we met in high school. And so he played a lot through high school. And then now we have a 12-year-old who also plays a lot. And yeah, we have that question over there about what is middle grade. And that's that, middle grade tends to be the 3rd through 5th grade, kind of up or lower, just depending. And so my kid's been in that middle grade zone. So we've been reading and reading a lot of middle grade books lately.
That's really one of the things that's nice about these groups is you can find people who have kids you can pump about. If you're sitting there writing and saying, what do 15-year-olds listen to today? What are you going to do? Just grab one off the street and ask her? No, you go and you ask a writer friend whose house has stuff with her 15-year-old's junk, and then you're in fine shape.
It's so funny because a lot of us actually have our kids will play video games online and things together. So a lot of us but we're friends as writers, but then our kids are also becoming friends too.
Mm-hmm. Seattle doesn't have anything that's like Willamette writers. I guess we have the Pacific Northwest Writers Association, and I have attended some of their programs. And they seem very, very focused on books as opposed to short stories, and very much on marketing, on being marketable and saleable. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because a lot of the other writing groups I've been involved with are much more about dealing with the quality of your writing in your own life as a writer, being a healthy rather than a neurotic writer.
I'm impressed that you guys moved to a let's keep the meetings open to everybody model, because that's where, some organizations you have to be a member, you have to cough up a fee to attend. And that's a good way to squeeze the membership down to the 5 people in the in-group.
Yeah. And I think it limits what you can do and like who your community is. And that was a really big, important thing for us, that it was open to everyone. And, as you were mentioning, the Pacific Northwest Writers Association, our PNWA, we talk with them a lot too. And as you're looking at writing conferences, so we do have a writing conference that happens in August. And that does have like a fee attached to it. When you look at writing conferences, you have Pacific Northwest Writers Association, San Francisco Writers Conference. There's one up in Surrey, the Surrey International Writers Conference, and Writers Digest. And those all look very similar, like to Willamette Writers also look similar with those conferences. And so we'll have, talk and and work across different organizations and have conversations about what we're trying to do as organizations. But just that idea that when you're looking at a writing conference, I would add, just take a look at all of them and see what's happening at a particular conference before you kind of choose which one's going to work for you.
Question: Does Willamette do readings? Do you have a reading series?
So
You
we have.
used to.
Yeah, so we have a couple of things that we do on that note. We've been doing a lot more open mics, and the open mic is with that idea that you're mixing in both like professionally published writers and writers who are just getting started. So then instead of limiting it to published writers, you get to try out new work and see what's working. So we have the open mics, and then we also run the Timberline Review, which is a literary journal. And the point of that is basically so people can come and see behind the scenes about how a literary journal works and what like the reading and the slush pile looks like and the editing process and all the way up through distribution. So that idea that, writers who've never gone through the publishing process before can see how it works. But you can also just submit. So you can submit your poetry and keep your fingers crossed and hope it makes it into the journal too. So.
Kate, have you ever experienced a 2-hour transport reading?
No, tell me.
Do you know about 2-hour transport?
I haven't been, no.
2-hour transport is this really amazing thing in Seattle. It's been going on for about 6 or 7 years, and it started at this totally funky restaurant. And the writers would come in, I think one night a month, and there was an open mic. And there's an hour of open mic, 5-minute slots, and then 2 published prestigious writers. And they kept this going online during COVID. In the summer, they have an In the Parks event with a speaker system and mic just to get everyone in person again. They are amazing.
I love that.
A lot of what's been great is the open mic has brought in a lot of people who didn't know other people, and has really created community. And they've even done an anthology. They're doing a second anthology now. But that's been my go-to group.
It's been so great to see that.
Yeah, and I like the idea of doing it outside in the summertime. And it's not very nice today, but if there are days outside when it's just so a pity to go indoors.
And I love hearing like that polished work.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really been lovely. And because before that, I got into this really, really, really late. I was in my 50s when I started writing fiction. And luckily, the mystery and science fiction writer, Kat Richardson, had a little write-in at a restaurant. And it happened every week. And I think if it hadn't been for that, I might not have kept going. That made a big difference for me as a beginner. You're almost having a physical learning process where what you learn is to sit there for 2 hours with people and respect your work. And then from there you can get into more structured stuff. But those little tiny, groups with maybe 15 people are just, and some people were major writers and some people, I don't know if they've ever published anything, but that was incredibly formative for new writers.
You know how I got into writing? I got a job at the National Press Building in Washington, D.C. And it is it's an office building, of course, and it was solidly full of writers. And mostly they were all journalists. It's the stringer for the Spanish newspapers. And he spends all his time going to congressional hearings and then writing something for the paper in Madrid or something. And to be surrounded by writers 9 to 5 every day, and they're all insane in the usual writery way. They had liquor bottles in the filing cabinets, and they had telexes. You remember those very loud machines, chunka chunka chunka, printing stuff out. They did all these stupid things, and then one day in the building there was a fire. The fire department came, and it turned out it was something really minor, like a trash fire, and so it wasn't important. But they pulled the fire alarm, and everybody in the 15-story building had to evacuate because you don't want to have a major tragedy. So we all climbed. They cut off the elevators, so we all had to climb down the staircase through down a 15-story building onto the street. And I looked as we were all hiking down these stairs. This was before there were laptop computers. Every single one of those journalists was clutching a wad of manuscript to his or her chest. And all of these manuscripts, they were not the story about, Lyndon Johnson's new policy about the law of the sea treaty. It was none of this boring stuff. It was their novels. They were carrying the manuscript of their novels to their chest and going down the stairs. These people are all writing novels on the side, on company time. That was inspirational.
I have to tell you that when I went to the Viable Paradise writing workshop, Deborah Doyle
Wasn't that great?
Deborah Doyle said that my strengths were that I'd been a journalist and I'd written every day of my life on deadline. And she said my weakness was that I wrote like a journalist.
Yep.
And she said to me, "You have to take your corset off." And it made perfect sense. It's interesting. Being a journalist or being a professional marketing writer, all those things are just great for developing your muscles and your endurance, and probably a hide like a buffalo if you were a journalist, because I've had my stories literally ripped to shreds. But they're not actually good for doing what Dean Wesley Smith calls depth.
Right. With journalists, you go fast and dirty.
When you are initiated into being a fiction writer, you take a lot of workshops that use all these techniques for giving people depth. And that's one of the hardest things.
That's always our biggest challenge too. Like I personally, when I write, I do the NaNoWriMo fast draft, first draft, just because on a regular basis, like I work on my writing in these little chunks. And so being able to get the full vision of the story out, and then work on it in little pieces throughout the rest of the year, it has been really a great way of doing it. But Karen, you also mentioned we have a write-in that we do online for Willamette writers, and it's, you write, we all open up the Zoom meeting and we talk for 15 minutes, and then we do a 45-minute write-in time, and then we do 15 more minutes of talking, and then 45 more minutes of writing. But that's when I get a ton of my work done every week, because it's Sunday night and I'm like, all right, I need to make sure that I finish the thing that I wanted to get done before the new week starts. So yeah, you kind of have that idea of making sure that you're setting aside time where you know that you can work on your writing, and it so helps to have other people who are supporting that in some way.
Do you guys have regular critique groups, or is that outside? Critique groups are very touchy things, because if you're in the right one, it's beautiful, and if you're in the wrong one, it can end your enthusiasm for writing.
And we had always basically let the chapters, all the different chapters, kind of encourage people to join critique groups and connect people. But then during the pandemic, we switched to also having online critique groups. So we have about 31 online critique groups that we kind of get started and get them rolling. And, about 20 of those now are just kind of like off doing their own thing, right?
Right.
And then they'll come back organizationally if they lose like a writer, if they need one more person, they might say like, do you have anyone else who might be a good fit for us? But Karen, you're so right, where it can definitely, you have to find the right fit. And I always tell people when they're joining a critique group that make sure it's a fit for you. So if it doesn't feel like, I'm going to use the word vibe. Like if the vibe is off, like if people feel like they're attacking you, or one of the big things that we emphasize is like a critique group is you're critiquing and you're helping the writer over time. So you're not working on one individual piece. Like it shouldn't just be that piece. It's how is this going to help the growth of the writer, like over the course of their career or their writing life. Like
that must be so helpful. I don't think I've ever been in a critique group. I run work by various friends every now and then, but I've never had a regular critique group. but I used to run them in the Washington, D.C. area when I was working for the Writers Center in Bethesda, Maryland. And essentially, we just do a writer's workshop for, 6 or 8 weeks or whatever it is. And then I would always say, you guys can either go and find another group, or you can just keep on meeting without me. Go to a Starbucks, and you can keep on grinding it around, because essentially we modeled it, and then you can pick it up and go.
Yeah, and I love that where you find the right group. But go ahead, Karen.
With Zoom, it's really started, people working together all over the country. And some people really say you can't form relationships over Zoom, and I really disagree. I'm involved right now with the Fairfield County writers, Fairfield County Writers Studio. And they have a variety of programs, some of which are expensive workshops, some of which are very inexpensive prompt groups. But Nina Kariki Hoffman from Oregon is teaching a lot of classes there. And through her classes, I have a lot of critique partners now who are from Connecticut, which is
oh my gosh. Yeah, that is what Zoom is going to do for us, really broaden the universe.
There's also something going on at Fairfield where they have a group that meets in the morning, and they get these wild prompts. And you just tune into the group and get your prompt and then go off and write. And Nina does it like every day. And she said that she sold a bunch of stories based on these prompts. And I don't normally like to work with prompts. I have very focused ideas about characters and meaning. And so when someone says to me, do a prompt about somebody was on fire, but she thought she knew why. And I'm like, really? But it turns out it's been really good for my writing.
Sometimes you need that orthogonal push, let's not go this way. Let's go that way.
It's like if you're doing physical training and you're always using particular machines or something, switching up and deciding you're going to run or you're going to row is it changes your whole approach to the workout.
Yeah, that's how I've ended up. I'm the vice president of the Oregon Poetry Association, and it mainly happened because poetry is something that I have loved since I was in like middle school and high school. Like I had poetry books, like stacks of poetry books, and as a random side note, one of my friends in high school became a choral music composer. And so he actually took a bunch of my poetry books and made them into this choral music, which was such a funny, it's so strange and wonderful to hear your work in ways that you're not expecting. But yeah, poetry for me was another way of looking at like similar themes and topics and ideas and trying them out in different forms and thinking about them differently, and like challenging myself to write in a way that's both concise but also so big and so beautiful. So yeah, as the person in chat says, yes to poetry.
Yeah, well, there's a science fiction poetry association too. There's a group for just about everything. And I think that it's important to even know about your fellow groups, just in case a poet rolls on up.
Yeah, one of my, there's two poets that let me know more about like the Science Fiction Poetry Association, and Brian Garrison, who was involved with the Science Fiction Poetry Association for a while. I got to know him through some Willamette Writers things and through some SIFWA things. But Catherine Quevedo is also a sci-fi fantasy poet, and I'd first seen her up reading, like so you would hear these pieces that it's like she took this huge science fiction fantasy novel and just smashed it down and made it into these like wonderful moments. And so I think that, sometimes I think of poetry as being an encapsulation of things, but sometimes it does things that I don't expect and I don't understand. So that's why it's really interesting and compelling to me as a genre too.
So maybe now is the time to think about, I still want to hear about Kickstarters. Kate has published a book with Kickstarter funding, and gosh, I've never actually found anyone who did that. And so I would love to hear about how this works. And I'm pretty sure the audience would like that too.
Yeah, so I think so my background is where I had originally I had gone the route of like trying to get an agent,
Right.
and it took me a while, and I was getting rejections. Then I started writing my next book, and then I eventually got a book accepted by a small press. But then it's called Shadow Girl, and a month before it was going to be published, and I had these events and things lined up, the small press folded.
Oh, great.
So then very suddenly I became an indie author, and I got my rights back, and I published those as indie, and then eventually those got republished by a really great small press that I love. So that's the Not a Pipe Publishing has that series, but then I personally also had another series that was going through a publisher that I took back and published indie. And so that's Clockbreakers. And so I started Kickstarter with that idea of, okay, so I'm indie publishing this. I want to get, not just get the funding for it, but get people like invested and involved in like part of the process of getting that book out there. Because so many people had become this amazing part of that community of writers and readers. So I originally had started Kickstarter with that idea in mind of like, okay, so I'm going to publish the second book in this Clockbreaker series, right? The first book is already out. And I honestly, as an indie author publishing a second book in a series, it was the best possible thing I could have done. Like, because a lot of times what happens is when you publish a second book or a third book, sometimes people will buy your first book.
They don't come back.
But they don't so a lot of times you just won't get as much traction as you think later in a series. And so that definitely for the second book and the third book in that series, like kept it going. So it made it completely possible for me to like finish out that series. And then I started 2 other series. So there's Mythwakers is another middle grade book that I have out that went through Kickstarter. And the most recent one, which y'all can check out, it's so Mythwakers and Wild Wings, but Mythwakers is the most recent one. So Mythwakers is a nonfiction book about the Minotaur, and it was basically I had done all this work with Clockbreakers, like thinking about Greek mythology and the Minotaur and like what he would really be like, and so I had all this background and research and knowledge, and I was like, I could totally write like a nonfiction kids book about this. And so that series really launched off of that idea of, I know a lot about this particular mythological creature. So that series is all about nonfiction series about mythological creatures. So you want me to talk a little bit about like how the Kickstarter actually works?
Yeah, because I have no idea how it works.
Yeah,
I'm mostly curious about, well, how you set the finances of it, because I'm seeing a lot of Kickstarters that do not seem based in a good analysis of how much money the person actually needs. And there are even Kickstarters where distributing the goodies ends up costing people more than they got in the Kickstarter.
Yes.
It's clearly there's secrets to be known, and I'm anxious to find out what they are. Exactly. Yeah. There's something.
There's definitely a formula, and I think let's see, Monica, and there's a Kickstarter book that might be helpful too, and we can find that in a little bit. But for me in particular, I was kind of estimating that the reasonable cost of a book for me was between $5,000 and $7,000, and with the initial like buying of the book and maybe the actual time you spent writing the book. Like that's the great part is like you can actually put that in as part of your consideration too. And the cover design, and if you have any editing and formatting, that's done by outside people too. So that 5,000 to 7,000, like I had set, like the 7,000 is kind of the high end for me personally. Just because a lot of if you're doing illustrations and working those throughout, I wanted to make sure that I was paying the illustrator or the cover designer, depending on what the project is. So I felt like for me as an indie author, I didn't want to set it too high. I think you could set that as a higher amount. But at the beginning of being published, like getting between $5,000 and $7,000 is great. Like, because the realistic part of publishing indie is sometimes, you know, a lot of people will never make $1,000 on a book. Like,
Right.
And so the way that I viewed it, and other people view it differently, is I really see it as also something you can do for like a pre-order. So you're creating this this Kickstarter, you're getting people involved and invested and engaged. They they order the book, and then the greatest thing about it still is you know who ordered the book. So you have that list of who is your community, who's buying your books, who's reading your books, because there's that difference between like, yeah, people that are your friends or people that are your family or people that are your fans, and then the people who are actually reading your book.
Right.
And so Kickstarter does that, where you get the names as opposed to the vague bookshop.org, Amazon bookstore thing where you're like, who bought the book? I have no idea. And yes, the get your book selling on Kickstarter, that's a good overview. And Monica and Russell do a good job of talking about Kickstarters in general. So I wanted to put that in there just as an idea that if you want to get more of an overall of how Kickstarter works. But for me, that idea of getting pre-orders, getting people involved and excited about your book is the best part of Kickstarter.
Would you do this again?
Yes, I totally would. I think it's stressful. I think the change I made in my last few Kickstarters was I used to have a longer period where the Kickstarter was open. And what I saw, and it might be different for other authors or other Kickstarter people, is at the very beginning, there'd be people who were doing the Kickstarter, and at the very end. And in the middle, you were talking a lot about the Kickstarter and you were doing a lot of work about the Kickstarter, but nothing was like moving the needle at all. So you were just like freaking out and worrying for however long it was. So now I do them shorter.
That.
Yeah, definitely.
That's interesting, because you would expect that it would be an ongoing thing, but obviously a deadline drives people. The idea that you got to do this by end of month, otherwise you're done. You know, you're going to miss the train. It's gone out of the station.
And I know there's people who fund their Kickstarters right away. Mine has usually been where a lot of it I'll see it's like half funded in the first couple of days, and then the rest of it comes right at the end.
Weird.
Yeah, it's so strange.
For people who aren't brave enough to do Kickstarter, the Pacific Northwest has some really good publishers, small publishers.
Oh, yeah.
There's Fairwood Press, there's Impatient Walrus, there's DEF CON, Don Vogel and Jeremy Zimmerman's thing, and they don't do a lot of books, but they obviously, your publisher gets a cut of the money, but what you get with a publisher, other than their excellent advice, is they're out there at conventions selling those books. Because once you've produced a book or a collection or an anthology, there's B Cubed Press. Bob is at the convention with a table full of books. And in addition to the B Cubed Press political spec fic line, he's also done some individual books for other folks, poetry and essays and stuff like that. And man, having that publisher behind you so you don't have to buy a table and sit at it for 4 days is amazing. Plus, it also opens you to a community of other writers published by that. I'm trying to think of some of the other small presses, because there are some very, very good ones out here.
Small Beer I believe is gone, which is really too bad. But there is the other thing is that if you're not really good at marketing, if you suck at it, then it's really good to have someone who is not sucky at it to help you do it. And a lot of writers have no more marketing sense than a butterfly. And at that point, it really would be better to not try and do it yourself if you could possibly do it. And if you could get some teamwork behind you on it. Otherwise you fall into the bit where you need to know about writer beware a lot.
I'm also seeing something, and you may be seeing this at Willamette Writers, where you get 2 or 3 indie writers who are in the same space, the same audience, and they market as a group. They get tables together, they do conventions together, and that's the groups that do this kind of stuff are really powerful. Brenda, you belong to Broad Universe, yes? No.
As a matter of fact, I don't, but I was just thinking about them as you were speaking.
Well, what's cool about Broad Universe is very loosey-goosey, and it's wonderful. It's a bunch of
and they're not a
female
publisher.
No, it's female identifying
they're not a
writers.
publisher.
But what they're doing is at just about every convention, they network with the convention organizers to make sure there is a reading spot. And then they're putting in 5 or 6 people, some big names like Cat Rambo, and some people you don't know. And what they do is I wrote an article for Locus with Tom Whitmore about how to do a read. And we interviewed Eileen Gunn, and she said, do it with other writers, because then all their friends come and you are exposed to the other writers, and their audience meets you. And Broad Universe is not an involved, it's not a complicated thing. I think it's $30 a year maybe, but they do some wonderful stuff. And these readings are just worth their weight in gold, because a beginning writer who has 10 short stories isn't going to get a convention asking them to do a solo reading. So I recommend that really, really highly. And also Broad Universe, I believe, at some conventions has marketing tables. And again, that's just, for a $30 annual membership, your book's going to be out there being marketed by professionals.
It is nice to have groups, being a reading by yourself is kind of frightening if you only have like 2 people showing up. It's better to do it with other people. And that's nice. It gets you, not only does it get your feet wet, but it's sort of like ego support, even if they all really came to hear Neil Gaiman and they're just waiting for you to finish reading so they can hear Neil. This is still okay.
Yeah, and a couple of things I would add on that, like I'm a big fan of the Northwest Independent Writers Association too. So they have a similar thing where you can, you pay a membership, and then they'll get books together and go to different fairs and conferences and things, and have a table there. There's a new one that's a business called Author Events Network also, and that's Portland and Seattle. They've been doing events, and that's one that I've seen a couple of my friends and other writers have been joining too. But in terms of one of those big things about being in readings together, anthologies the last few years have been really fun on my side, and also in Portland in general. There's been a couple of anthologies I've been with through like Underland Press and Mark Teppo and Francis Piapolito, kind of some where like Francis, for example, did a horror anthology that was all cozy cosmic with Mark Teppo. And one of those things is, just getting other authors, and then you have this community of people who are sharing your stories and talking about your work. And so if you feel like one of those authors where you're just shouting into a void, having a group of authors who is also in the same book.
Man, I feel as a short story writer so incredibly fortunate, because unlike people who are writing only novels and are out there on their own, the anthology gives me a manufactured community. And I just,
you're all pushing that book.
I was at a SIFWA meeting at a Worldcon where I did not know anybody. I had just joined SIFWA, and there was this big famous writer who got lost, and I actually got him to the SIFWA suite, and I knew who he was, and he said to me, "Who are you?" And I squeaked, "I'm in this anthology." And he threw his arms up and said, "Oh, I'm in that too." And I thought, wow, here I am. Or as I was once in an anthology with Bob Silverberg and mentioned this to him, and he said, "You and me and Edgar Allan Poe," because Edgar Allan Poe was reprinted in the anthology. But short stories and anthologies, George R.R. Martin believes that you write short stories before you write novels, which is an old school approach.
Yes.
But in terms of forming community, those short stories are very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you, into the community, readings take place in places, often bookstores.
That's
Does
hard.
Willamette writers have affiliations with and relationships with bookstores?
Yes, we do. We have affiliations with bookstores, a lot of affiliation with libraries too, I should say. And personally, I'll go for a personal side of, I love Annie Blim's bookstore in Multnomah Village. That's the closest bookstore to me. And one of those things I've loved is they've always been like really supportive, but also really supportive of indie writers and like bringing in a reading, and they make it such a great experience. So Annie Blim's has been one of my favorites for a long time. And then I also worked with like Another Read Through bookstore. Another Read Through does a really great thing with Willamette writers. And Another Read Through used to have a store in Portland, and now they're online. And it's a queer-owned female bookstore. And what she did for Willamette writers is make us like a bookshop.org page. So whenever anyone buys a book from our page, the proceeds come back to Willamette writers as a donation. And so that was a really big helpful thing that kind of made it easier for us to talk about authors' books and have somewhere to point them to that like both supported Willamette writers and like supported the Portland bookstore community too. So
that's one of the things, is that you want people to be able to buy the book. And if you can work that synergy that the local bookstore gets a little piece of this, everybody's happy.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I would that I've never heard anyone talk about as a way to advance a writer's career is to be the interviewer of a well-known writer. I've been invited by the U Bookstore to do that a few times, and that has been just amazing for my visibility, because people don't think she's a real writer. She's up there interviewing people from Tor. And it's definitely been useful for me also, in that I've learned a lot of professional techniques from watching these writers doing a national tour. It's all community.
And on that, I get to do a fun one at Powell's bookstore with Therese O'Neill at the downtown Powell's. And she's a nonfiction writer. And so our worlds kind of cross in terms of like writing nonfiction and thinking about like folklore and research. And her book is called Unbecoming a Lady. And so it's all about like Victorian ladies who were like smashing the patriarchy, like, and it's on National Women's Day in March. So, we're going to get on fancy hats and dresses, and we're going to make it a whole thing.
Call me. I have a Jane Austen outfit.
Oh, wonderful.
Call me. I have a hat and everything.
Make David Levine get dressed up and then beat up on him?
You should. You should.
You should.
Yes, we're working on this, honey. There are people behind you.
Yeah.
It's going to be so great.
We're having a great time, Bob. Hi.
Hi. I hate to interrupt, but I had a question for Kate.
Yeah.
Kate, can you tell us a little bit about this book that I got obscuring your face?
Yeah, so that's Clockbreakers. So that's a middle grade series. It's about a girl in a wheelchair, and she gets a key to go back in time. And so the first book is back into Greek mythology, and the second one is into Irish mythology, and the third one is into Norse mythology. And that book series really started, we have the We Need Diverse Books movement that started. And the first Clockbreakers book came out right before that. So I had been thinking about this idea of, okay, so, all right, so what if we have my neighbor, right, who her name is Gracie, and she's amazing. And she is this, just at the time, she was this 12-year-old girl with so much energy and life and vitality. And she was going to go through, she had scoliosis. And so she was going to have to go through this back surgery. So we started having a lot of discussions about like, what it would be like to be in a wheelchair. And like, and then at the same time, a lot of you know that like my son also had heart surgery, and so we were thinking about a lot of those issues too. And then at the same time, one of our other neighbors, like their daughter was diagnosed with a really terrible disease that was going to leave her in a wheelchair.
Oh my gosh!
And so it was like all of these things coming together, and a lot of wanting to see better books out there, and wanting these kids to have books that they could read. And so Clockbreakers was based on that idea of, okay, like what's it really like to have like a really great adventure with a kid that's in a wheelchair, and that's a part of like who she is, and she's going out on this adventure with her friends, and basically, you know, going out to save the world type of thing. And so my only other add-ons, because y'all are writers, is when my agent at the time was pitching this out, and it went out to, you know, major publishing houses, and editors were reading it. And it just wasn't like finding a place. Like, and as a writer, you do that thing of like, all right, so like sometimes it's the book is not good enough. Sometimes it's the timing is not right. But one of the editors came back with like, does she have to be in a wheelchair? Like, can she not be in a wheelchair for this book? And that kind of basically just shifted a lot of my career of going like, you know, that there's times when you like can push on the industry and push for changes, and there's times where you can take it in your hands, and you know, in my case, I went and worked with a small press, and then eventually that series became an indie book series. But just that idea that like, yeah, we need better stories, and we need the stories that are like for all kids. And so over the last few years, I've seen so many of those like amazing changes happen in middle grade in particular. I'm going to say like, that's where I've seen kind of some of the most changes, which is amazing that like kids get to read these books where they can see themselves like not just in the book, but actually like on the cover and as main characters and as protagonists, like heading out into those fabulous like fantasy worlds too. So.
Well, and they say that writing cannot change the world. Hopefully this is it, because those kids will grow up.
Yes.
And we will change the effing world.
Now, I also got to say, I did love the cover theme for the series. It was wonderfully done. But I had another question, only this time, Brenda.
Yeah.
What can you just had this... just got released here, didn't you?
Well, you know that this is the novel A Door in His Head, and it won the Grandview, the Diverse Voices Prize from Grandview University, and they put out a paper edition, which is on Amazon somewhere, but they didn't want the ebook rights. So I ran the ebook through Bookview Cafe, and they did a different cover for it because, you know, you didn't have the rights for the other cover, and this cover is so much better. The previous cover was brown. This one is blue, and I think, frankly, blue is a prettier color. So, if for your ebook needs, the people who just do not want to handle a paper book, this is it, and it is just out.
Well, thank you, because you did get a nice award for this book, correct?
Yeah, but this is not their edition. But hang on, I'm going to fish up the other. Yeah, here we go. I'm going to put the link to the Amazon one in the comments, and you can see brown is not anywhere near so fun. But of course, if you insist on a paper book, then you sort of have to live with it.
Well, that is good. While you do that.
Yeah.
Let me do the sad part of every one of these podcasts, and that is bring it down to an end. And I appreciate all of you coming here. The Willamette.
Damn it.
He did it.
Hey, I can learn. Because Karen reminded me of something that John A. Pitts, one of the great writers that, like so many in the Northwest, have passed on too young with so much unsaid. when I first booked him for a convention, I misspelled his name. And when he corrected me, I said, "Are you sure?" Now, the reason I looked up when I said, "Are you sure?" because anyone talking to John A. Pitts looked up when they talked to him. Not only a physically large man, but just a one of the most genuinely wonderful men you could ever see. Know that you can always look up to John Pitts, even in memory. But where was I? Now Karen has got such a large. I mean, I've looked over at her bibliography, and I'm proud to have been part of it. But this brings us up to what we're doing next week. And I don't believe Karen will be able to join us. I mean, something about your partner's birthday, you know.
Tom's
And,
birthday.
Yeah. And is that your cat?
That's Toby. He's 26 years old. Let me turn
Aw.
off my sound.
Oh, I love it. I now have my cat lives in the garage, and is a happy cat out there. He comes, sits on the back porch to remind me that it's time to go out and open a can of cat food. He does not, Roger, his name, does not accept the notion that I can just put a bowl of cat food out there and a chicken waterer and let him be. No, no, no. He wants the personal attention of peeling the top off. But Karen, next week, we have invited Deborah Godfrey, has edited for us a wonderful book called Madam President. And it's not the idea of the Madam President of the United States. It's Madam President of the PTA.
Oh, very good.
Madam President of the engineering department on a starship. It's women in leadership role, women in charge, how they get there, how they do it different, and how to I don't know if it's a good how-to on how to deal with them, but because the one of my favorite in there is Madam President of the Homeowners Association during an alien invasion, where she has to marshal all of the condo owners to defend and make them behave during the invasion. So it's a great book. So next week we're having assorted writers from this anthology going to come on and help pitch it a little bit, so that when it shows up on your bookstores next month, or as soon as we get the cover, Karen.
Yes.
Karen
Yes.
has got such a creative mind. I sicked the editor on her and said, "See if Karen's got any ideas for how this should look." And
I actually have one. I'm going to send something over to her.
Oh, good. Yeah, nothing quite like the public reminder, and I didn't mean to do it that way. That was just
That's okay,
that was me and
Ron.
my way I do it. But sometimes. But anyway, I want to thank all of you and for coming and living in the Pacific Northwest and having run a successful writers group for many years. That was my practice for becoming an editor at BQ Press. There is no better training than to be in a critique group for 15 years. And so thank you all for coming. Now, any last closing remarks? Starting off with Kate.
You all are great. Thanks for inviting me to come chat with you this morning. That was wonderful.
Well, we'd love to have you back again. I mean, we do not believe in a one time and out approach to life.
And there's so much more we can talk about. You know, we have to get more deeply into like the various chunks of the association and other writer groups. If they start gearing it up with Worldcon, we have to have a little chat about that, because
Yay.
that one we could have some serious fun with, and that's coming up. And so, a lot of good things. We have to talk. Woo.
Kate, I'm doing programming for WorldCon, the writing track. So be
Oh,
in touch.
fun. Yeah,
And I want
totally.
to say to the audience, find other writers. Don't do it alone. Whether you end up at a big convention or hanging out with some people in the local coffee shop while you all type on your laptop, do it. It is so rewarding.
Mm-hmm. Peer pressure is sometimes bad. Here you are, doing needle drugs, but you can use peer pressure for good.
I tell you, the first time I ever attended a convention and participated in the writers' workshop, we were paranoid. We just knew that. So we took the writers group. We were only like 6 of us, but we polished those stories and polished them. And then we had Victoria Mitchell, Jim Glass, and John Dalmas, and MJ Ing were the 4 writers. And after the workshop, John went to the convention and asked them if we were for real, or were we just trying to make them look like idiots by handing them off professionally published manuscripts for them to stumble over. And when I thought about that is the real value of a writer's group. One of the values that it can help you take what in many, many cases is a slightly amateurish bit of work. And even though none of you are real professionals, help you turn it into a semi-professional looking piece of work to the point that you can you get him to say, and this is back in the day, he looked up from it and said, "You need to send this over to Gardner over at Asimov's and tell him I said to." Well, Gardner didn't buy it, but it was still, you just, I can't overestimate the value or overstate the value of a good supportive writers group and working and dealing with other writers to help improve your work, their work, and a shared endeavor. Because writing can be a collaborative and enjoyable experience in the right place, in the right times. I mean, it's done alone, but a support structure is critical. So thank you all for coming. And any last words from Karen or Brenda?
No, we are good.
No, thank you, Bob.
Thank you all. And I'm pushing